All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session today for the Conversations of South Asia series. This webinar is, we aim to feature some of the recent and most prominent books published in the field of South Asian studies. And the titles that we choose are selected with consultation with South Asia faculty here at Dartmouth. And I also want to add that this series, this webinar is housed at the Department of Asian Societies, Languages and Cultures at Dartmouth College. And we are sponsored very generously by the Borders Family Endowment Fund. Thank you all for being here. To introduce myself, my name is Faiza Rahman, and I'm the coordinator of this series. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Religion. Our session today is being moderated by Professor M.K. Long. M.K. Long is a historian and ethnographer of Buddhism and gender, primarily in Myanmar. She earned her PhD in the Department of Asian Studies at Cornell University in 2024, and currently she serves as a lecturer in religion, where she teaches courses on religion and gender. Both in South and Southeast Asia. She also works on contested belonging and Buddhist literature in between the two regions. Thank you all for being here, and I would now like to hand over the floor to Professor M.K. Long to introduce our book author and the panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much, Faiza, Dr. Rahman, and to Alicia, our BODUS Fellow, for the administrative work that has gone into setting up today's event. So my role will be to introduce today's participants and to moderate the discussion. So I'll start after these introductions. First, we'll hear from today's author, Anne Blackburn, and then each of our two discussants in turn. If each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes. After the two discussants, the author will have a chance to respond to questions or comments raised by the discussants. And then if we have time, we'll open things up for questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so by using the Q&A box. And then when there's time, I'll voice those questions into the conversation. None of these short introductions will do justice to our participants, but I am hoping to maintain as much time as possible for our conversation today. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome Anne Blackburn, Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Humanities in the Department of Asian Studies at Cornell University. Anne studies Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia at the intersection of literary studies, intellectual history, and political economy, with a particular interest in intellectual, monastic, institutional, political, and trade circulations involving the locations now known as Sri Lanka, India, Burma, and Thailand. It is these circulations that are the subject of the book we are focused on today, Buddhist-Inflected Sovereignties Across the Indian Ocean, a Pali Arena, 1200 to 1550, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2024. I just note briefly that the book is now published online, entirely open access, which is a trend I hope we continue to see more and more of in academic publishing. Buddhist-Inflected Sovereignties joins Anne's earlier books, Buddhist Learning and Textual Practice in 18th Century Lankan Monastic Culture, published in 2001, and Locations of Buddhism, Colonialism and Modernity in Sri Lanka, published in 2010. In continuing to redefine the kinds of questions scholars ask about religion and statecraft, the kinds of people understood as theorists of religion and sovereignty, and the multiple forms of evidence, language, and landscape that belong in conversation with one another in pursuit of such queries. We can see from the book's title alone the extreme care with which Blackburn formulates her terms of analysis, and from the book's multicentric and multimedia methods, the kind of scholarly prowess and collaborative spirit that it took to accomplish this work. So I'm so delighted to have you with us here today to hear more about your work, Anne. After we hear from Anne, we'll hear brief remarks from two discussants. First, from Professor Azfar Moin, Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Moin studies the early modern Islamic world from comparative perspectives with a focus on concepts and practices of sovereignty. His 2012 book, The Millennial Sovereign, Sacred Kingship and Sainthood in Islam, won the Best First Book in the History of Religions Award from the American Academy of Religion, the John F. Richards Prize in South Asian History from the American Historical Association, and an honorable mention for the Bernard S. Cohen Book Prize from the Association for Asian Studies. Personally, I'm so excited to see Anne's book in conversation with Dr. Moin's work, especially in the context of the South Asia webinar, to expand the Indian Ocean region with further comparative discussions of sovereignty. So second, we'll hear from Dr. Philip Friedrich, an independent scholar and historian of premodern Sri Lanka. His research and writing has focused on political culture and monastic discipline, mercantile networks, inscriptions, and political arguments about the past in present-day Sri Lanka. He holds a PhD in South Asian Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. So please allow me now to turn things over to our author, Anne Blackburn, to offer some introductory comments on the book.
Thanks very much, MK. Extraordinarily generous and unduly generous, I think, but thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here today participating in a Conversations on South Asia event with Dartmouth. And I would like to thank my longtime colleague and collaborator, Dr. MK Long and Dr. Faiza Rahman at Dartmouth for orchestrating this event. And we have benefited a lot from the efforts also of Alicia Qureshi, whom we are not seeing at the moment, but has been active behind the scenes. To be in conversation with all of you, and then with our sort of special commentators, Dr. Friedrich and Dr. Moin, that's really a special pleasure and an honor for me. Azfar and Phil, in different arenas, or different contexts, we have been in conversation for some years, and I have learned a great deal from you both, and feel always enlivened by your scholarship. And so to have a conversation is a precious opportunity. In fact, I'm tempted to say very little to hear more from all of you. But thank you once again for joining. So there are a number of things that might be useful to say at the outset as I'm thinking about the book now, again, a few years after its publication. I think part of what I would say by way of preface is just that it has really struck me over the years that those of us who work in Buddhist studies, we, often seem to, I should put it differently, those of us who work in study of Buddhism in what we might call South and Southeast Asia, or as I have once argued, Southern Asia, as encompassing geography, it seems to have been often hard for us to kind of bring our work into conversation with other historians of the regions. And in trying to develop this book, I was interested in seeing if there was a way of talking about this particular history involving the island we now know as Sri Lanka and parts of what we think of as the South and Southeast Asian mainland, ways of talking about that history in a way that might allow people who are not religious studies scholars particularly, not Buddhist studies scholars particularly, to kind of engage more with our work, and to show also that we are engaging with their work. So one of the things I was engaging with in the book was trying to find a way to write things that are, on the one hand, will engage quite specialist readers in Buddhist studies or history of parts of the region I'm discussing, and at the same time trying to find a way to lift some claims in terms of analyses kind of above the detail in such a way that they might be engaged more broadly. I don't know if I have succeeded or not, but that was an intention. I also started thinking about the book in the 20 teens, when there had been an upsurge, in a sense, in the Indian Ocean conversation related to especially Southeast Asia studies and Sri Lanka studies. And I had the luxury of doing some of that thinking at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, and I'm deeply grateful for that opportunity. It became more of a question for me, to what extent would it be helpful? Would it be useful? Might it be analytically generative to bring some studies of Indian Ocean histories, especially in this early second millennium period, into more explicit conversation with some of the Buddhism-related or Buddha-sasana dispensation of Buddha-related materials that I knew from my own work in what we now call Sri Lanka. I think another kind of background question for me, or framing motivation for me, is that it's as scholars of Buddhism in Southern Asia know extremely well, it's been tough to tell a history of what happens between like 600 and 1600. Sometimes what people say is, well, Theravada Buddhism, like takes root in Southeast Asia during this time. It arrives, it takes root, it expands, it extends, or whatnot. We haven't really had a very, somehow, a very adequate, larger scale account of this kind of a period of Buddhist history in Southern Asia. We've had a number of really remarkable and helpful smaller scale studies. People would sometimes ask me, how do we understand this period of the history of Theravada Buddhism, and can we tell the history of Theravada Buddhism between, say, the end of the works of eminent commentators around 500-600 AD or CE, and when we start to have a very a much kind of larger archive with, roughly speaking, colonial era going forward in Sri Lanka and other parts of the region. It just it seemed to me it should be possible to do something, but I didn't know how to do it. And gradually, as the Indian Ocean historical work was emerging more and more, I began to think, okay, well, maybe one way of starting to tell a history of Buddhism in the region I call Southern Asia, encompassing a good bit really of what we think of as South and Southeast Asia, maybe it would be possible to do that in some kind of through an approach involving a kind of circulatory systems vision, and also in some ways a connected histories vision. And here, of course, a deference to a person who has inspired a number of us, Professor Sanjay Subramaniam. So I was effectively kind of thinking, how could we talk about the history of Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia or Southern Asia in a period that hasn't been treated too much with longue durée, big picture studies. Would it be helpful to bring Buddhist studies more into conversation with Indian Ocean studies for this region? It has been done a lot further for material context further east. Is there a way to get the Buddhist studies scholars and the historians of South Asia into more conversation, and historians of Southeast Asia as well? And then, I was trained in Sinhala and Pali language, and I've always been kind of wondering, again, how could we tell a larger story about the history of Pali as not, Pali textuality or intellectual culture involving the language of Pali? But how could we tell it in a way that also doesn't make Pali as a language unduly centered? Because, of course, this is a very richly and dynamically multilingual milieu over a long period of time I'm thinking about. And probably my interest in this question stems in part from a really rich work from two former teachers of mine whom I would want to mention here. Charles Hallisey, Professor Hallisey, who early on, I think when he was still a doctoral student, wrote this article on the civilizational history of Buddhism, which, really is very, very generative for thinking about kind of mesoscale and larger scale histories of Buddhism. And then, the work of my former teacher, the late Professor Stephen Collins, whose work on Pali Imaginaire, it doesn't do the kind of historical work that I'm trying to do in this book, but it's definitely, in my mind, as I have been doing this work. And Collins was very forthright in his own work, saying, look, there's a lot of other, historical approaches to what we, how to think about this language of Pali, and how to think about it historically. So Pali, we have a wide audience of South Asianists here, so I realize I need to just check in and say, what is Pali? This is, I'm talking about Pali as a language of Buddhist textual authority and liturgical use that became quite widespread, in part through processes I'm trying to articulate, in the course of the first and second millennia AD or CE. We could call it a scriptural language if you want that. We could call it, to use that kind of term, we could call it a link language if you want to use that kind of term. But in the present day, it's the scriptural and liturgical language of focus for a community of Buddhists or a tradition of Buddhists who we now call participants in the tradition of Theravada Buddhism. And that term has its own history and et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about that maybe later or not. But just to say, Pali is a language that has come to do a lot of work in a particular part of some parts of the Buddhist world, and is now associated with what we call Theravada Buddhism, widely practiced tradition in parts of South and Southeast Asia. This language of Pali becomes, it's as I will try to convey in my book, it becomes more and more a central part of intellectual culture and kind of elite practice, if you will, through a long history, which I try to trace in part. It is never the single language in play. And in the book, I talk a bit about the kind of multilinguality and try to treat that with some subtlety. But this led me in my work for the book to propose a term I use, the Pali Arena. And what I would like to say by way of these opening remarks, is that when I use the term Pali Arena in the book, I'm not talking about like a stable, static place on a map. We can color it in and say that's the Pali Arena. It's like simply a term of art, we could say, that I was using in my own mind to conceptualize some kind of dynamic and multi-local scenario. And my question, in effect, is, or was in the book and remains certainly, who does what with Pali language and Pali language kind of derived materials, where, when, why? And I was like interested in thinking about Pali textuality, which includes, in my mind, as I say in the book, works written in Pali, composed in Pali, but also works composed in local literary languages that are significantly indebted to earlier Pali language compositions. Pali textual materials moved around this space I talk about in the book, and they arrive. Part of the story of the book is Pali coming to do more work in places where it did not do that much work before. And when it arrives and begins to do more work, what parts of it arrive, what aspects of Pali textuality arrive, and what kind of work does it do, and how does it do that work in a context of arrival, which is not a blank slate, not a tabula rasa, but of course context with their own dynamic histories. So this is, in some ways, is a circulatory history of a particular, language and textual culture. I think I must be getting near to time. How am I doing, MK? Yeah, 1 minute. Okay, so let me just say then that sovereignty was initially not my planned focus for the project. But the reason that I came into a study of sovereignty was that when I was looking at materials that would allow me to do a study over a number of 100 years in this early second millennium period, with enough material to be comparative, the material I could work with really was a material that engaged, that was prepared by rulers or sovereigns or strong persons, or addressed themes to do with sovereignty. So in some ways, my emphasis on sovereignty in the book came about by virtue of an evidentiary state of affairs that I found it was a theme that I could carry across a fairly, substantial period of time and a fairly large geography. So if I was wanting, as I did, if I wanted to give a trans-regional history of polytextuality in circulation and inquiring about how aspects of polytextuality are being picked up and worked with in some way in particular local contexts, and I needed a theme that could carry across. Sovereignty was the theme that I decided to work with because many of the materials I had available are elite materials composed in courtly contexts. So that's, I think I would stop with that. There are things that we could say, and I think they're going to come up in the Q&A or the discussion. What does it mean to say Buddhist inflected, and why would that be useful or not? Why am I saying let's be cautious about this term Theravada Buddhism? We could talk about that later if people would like to. How does this relate or not relate to other kinds of linguistic, communities? We could talk about that, but I leave it there with Pali Arena is not a place on a map. Sovereignty was what I kind of now think of as a happy accident.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne. So now I'll invite our first response from Dr. Moin.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to be part of this conversation. It's a real pleasure to read Professor Blackburn's book, Buddhist-Inflected Sovereignty, and I'm so glad that she found this theme of sovereignty. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here because I would have nothing else to say as far as Buddhism is concerned. But I really appreciated the geographic span and centuries-long scope of the book because my own interest has developed in this direction in understanding long-term changes in the institutions and practices of sovereignty in Islam, spanning from its origins in Arabia to other parts of Asia. I've also developed a broader comparative and sociological framework in collaboration with Alan Strathern at Oxford on sacred kingship in world history. And today I'll draw on this framework as well as my knowledge of Islamic history to comment on and ask questions of Professor Blackburn's study. So the first question that really, I got as I was reading the book, it was just running through my mind is what happens to the sacredness of kings with the adoption of Buddhism? And so first of all, and you see this in the introduction, that there's a tension between the ideal of the Buddha and that of the Chakravartin or the Chakravarti, and the two are being brought together, but you can see that there is a tension, and we know which one is the better path. And there is an Islamic proverb that prophets and kings are twins that also captures this tension. If they're twins, then why aren't they interchangeable, right? And the answer to that question comes up on page 56, 57, when you see that the requirement to become a Buddha or take the path of Buddhahood is to give up the world. And we get the example from Sri Lanka of King Parakram Bahu II, who is criticized for not taking the final step. And his excuse is that he doesn't want to lose his sons. He doesn't want to give up his sons. And we also see the requirement later on, and that in one inscription that kings have to devote themselves completely to perform all the 5 precepts of non-monastic life all the times. And what the overall picture that I got from this was that Buddhism was actually constraining kings to a particular ideal. And if you actually committed yourself as a king to Buddhism, it actually is going to bound you to certain actions, or bind you to certain actions. And in comparison with biblical and Islamic ideals of kingship, we find something similar, which is those ideals too impose severe restrictions on kings and in some ways desacralize kingship. So, for example, the title of caliph or khalifa in the Quran is actually a demotion of kingship. It means deputy or governor. It's not a king. The most celebrated king in the Quran is Solomon or Suleiman. But his job or his goal, the Quranic Suleiman, is to spread monotheism, is to convert pagan kings and to bring an end to sun worship. Uh, and so, in some ways, he strives in the name of biblical religion or monotheism, but not for his own glory. So, the short of it is soteriology or salvation of oneself, community, and indeed of all humanity is the primary goal, it seems, for kings. That seems to be the duty of kings in Buddhism as well as Islam. And you can actually say in biblical monotheism, to give an example from Deuteronomy, that the ruler is expected to read the Torah all day long, right? It's sort of the same thing as following the five precepts all day long. So the question is, why would any king want to become a Buddhist or a Muslim if that's the life? And that brings us to this larger question of what is the relationship of these salvation religions to kingship? And in Sacred Kingship and World History, the volume that I did with Alan, we developed this model of that there are essentially two types of religious scenarios. One we call transcendence or transcendentalism, and the other was immanentist or immanentist religions. The transcendence has to deal with essentially salvation, truth, doctrine, right? Sometimes we use the shorthand faith, but these things don't really mean anything when you look at immanentist religions, which really are about ritual, sacred objects, sacred places, trying to draw power and protection from the cosmos. And the transcendentalist religions, of course, do have immanentist features, but they're always in some sort of a subordinate position. That was the sort of the broadly what the framework we came up with. And in terms of kingship, we get essentially two types of kingship then: divinized kingship in immanentist frameworks, and righteous kingship in transcendentalist frameworks. So in Buddhism, we see the example of the ideal, at least, is that of righteous kingship. And in the case studies in Buddhist-Inflected Sovereignties, we see that these two ideals are in tension with one another. So, for example, in the book, Professor Blackburn points out on page 72 two religious concepts. She says organizing soteriology, and seeking protective potency, right? So organizing soteriology, if that's the duty of kingship, that's transcendence or transcendentalist religions. And protective potency is a very different religious ideal. And in some ways, what we're seeing is a transition from one to the other, right? And Buddhism saying, or at least the Buddhist framework is that it's a unified framework for supplying both salvation as well as protective potency. So we get the case study early on of Rama the Bold of Sukhothai, that in which he doesn't seem to be fully committed to the soteriological mission of Buddhism, which is the inscription 1 is where a local deity is invoked for protection, and then later on Buddhism is invoked and invoked in a rather generic fashion, if I understood the argument correctly. However, as time goes by in that broader region, we see a greater commitment of kings to sort of the Buddhist ideals. So, for example, there's a statement that in Thailand from a later period, all the statues discovered in one area were Buddhist rather than Brahmanic. We get the example of the king Dhamaraja, who uses what looks like millenarian urgency, that all Buddha relics are about to disappear, to urge people to commit themselves zealously to Buddhism, right? And later on, the same ruler deploys relic enshrinement and inscription installation at strategic locations in all directions. And then of course, a century or so later, these ideals are even sort of more elaborated in greater detail. Ashoka is remembered and praised as an exemplar of a missionary king. And then, merit-making acts are are really directed towards the salvation of all humanity, right? So, is it right to detect then an arc of greater adoption of Buddhism so that what was originally Buddhist inflected actually does become some sort of something that we can call Buddhist kingship if these ideals are so entrenched and so constraining kings? Um, so that was one question that I had. Now, just to sort of for a slight change of pace, if you look at what happens to Buddhism and Islam on the other side of Asia, especially Iran, there is this 13th century moment when the Mongols conquer Iran and they rule as non-Muslims, and Buddhists show up from Kashmir and Tibet and try to convert them, and they actually offer them the title of Chakravarti. And the Muslim courtiers then in return offer them an astrological title, the Lord of Conjunction. And this is in the study by Jonathan Brack it's called An Afterlife of the Khan. And eventually, of course, the Mongols convert. Partly the reason is because their soldiers have converted to Islam, so they adopt, and there are acts of zeal and iconoclasm. But when the dust settles, actually, it's the uh, it's the it's the astrological title that dominates rather than some of the Islamic ideals that had been the case before the Mongols. For example, the notion of the caliphate sort of loses its potency while the astrological title dominates. So, and this sort of brings me to a concluding point, which is there was the discussion of the king's expertise in the technical sciences, specifically astronomy and astrology, and also some of the monks' expertise. Their value was not that they discovered Buddhist relics, but the fact that they could perform astrological calculations. And in that, the question is, are these in tension with Buddhist-inflected sovereignty? Is there a hierarchy or a hierarchy that develops? Because at least in the Mongol and Mughal cases, and we see this in Mughal India later on, especially with Emperor Akbar, that an astrological and cosmological vision is imposed, which actually tries to parochialize Islam and essentially says salvation of the individual or the community is no longer the business of the state, right? So it's a reverse, right? So with that, let me just end with three questions for later discussion. So to summarize my points, first is that when Buddhism inflected sovereignty is enacted or articulated, what are the factors that allow it to dominate or to be dominated, right? And that's the sort of the context behind why would somebody adopt it or give it up. At what point can we say that Buddhist inflected sovereignty it comes to be adopted to the degree that rulers become Buddhist kings? And when this occurs, can we call this a form of zealous kingship, which is Buddhism has actually imposed top down? And then finally, do we have reverse cases such as the Mughal case, when Buddhist inflections were subtracted or even excised from the institutionalization or institutionalized sovereignty? And when that happens, or if that happens, what sacred cosmologies or knowledge traditions can replace Buddhism? And if this did not happen, then what allowed Buddhism to become so well entrenched in the sphere of sacred kingship over time? Thank you.
Thank you so much for really exciting questions. So I'll now turn it over to Dr. Friedrich.
Great. First, I just want to say thank you to Faiza, MK, and Alicia for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to engage with Anne's book in this forum. I've followed the evolution of Anne's arguments in Buddhist-Inflected Sovereignties over several years, and it's a real privilege to have the chance to reflect on them holistically with her in the room. Rather than recap the book's main arguments, I thought I would flag a few of what I see to be the book's major interventions, reflect on some of the interpretive terrain that it opens up, and raise a few related questions that can hopefully set the stage for a wider discussion. My remarks probably reflect my own biases as a historian of medieval Sri Lanka, But given how small this field is and how infrequently a work of this magnitude comes along, I want to be sure that the implications it has for the historical study of Sri Lanka are adequately conveyed. So Anne asks us to consider a Pali Arena, a transregional space constituted not by contiguous territory, but by shared textual practice, monastic networks, and the circulation of learned persons, manuscripts, and ritual authority. The period she traces is one of social, political, economic, and religious transformation in Sri Lanka. It is the era of Polonnaruwa's decline as a center of an agrarian civilization, the fragmentation of single polities, the rise of a series of smaller royal courts in locales like Dambadenia and Gampala, and ultimately their sort of consolidation at Kotte. However, whereas previous historians interpreted these changes as evidence of sort of medieval decline or turbulence wrought by external influences from South India, and rightly, I think, sees this as a period of extraordinary dynamism. It's an account of medieval Sri Lanka that is, I think, true to the source material and also is an important step in bringing Sri Lanka into discussions of regional dynamism that have characterized the study of medieval India over the last 20 years or so. So Anne accomplishes this through her methodology, and in particular, the way in which she is able to tack back and forth between inscriptional and non-inscriptional texts, material objects, the locutions for the installation of such objects, and building projects. While previous generations of scholars have interpreted such sources as passive records of historical events or sort of reflections of some cosmic symbology, for Anne, these materials are very much active interventions in the world around them. They aim to shape social, political, economic, and religious realities in response to varied objectives. The picture that results from such a methodological approach is one that has major implications for our understanding of the Lankan state during the early second millennium. Gone is this image of the state as a rigid, bureaucratic structure hanging above society, with its elevated position legitimated with reference to unchanging models of Theravada Buddhist kingship. In its place, Anne offers a different, and I would say far more convincing picture of the state as a kind of dynamic process in which political figures constantly negotiate with one another for authority. These contestations were, in Anne's book, sort of indexed in part by how political actors could demonstrate their own prowess in establishing the Buddha Sasana. In practice, this didn't mean simply reproducing doctrinal models of the Sasana's establishment, but creatively reworking historical inheritances in response to local exigencies. And as a result, the boundaries of what it could mean to be a Buddhist king and how one went about representing themselves as such also expanded and contracted in ways that both reflected and made possible new opportunities for figures beyond the king himself. So Anne's book also demonstrates that what she calls the sort of accrual of possible models and pathways for argumentation about the relationship between sovereign and Buddha Sasana had a life outside of Sri Lanka. In doing so, Anne refuses to use the nation as an analytical frame. And I mean, this is a move that I think is very much appreciated from me and other scholars, in part because for too long, Sri Lankan historiography has treated the island as a kind of a source of Theravada orthodoxy, dispensing texts, relics, and ordination lineages outward towards a grateful periphery. Her idea of the Pali Arena instead gives us a genuinely multinodal space in which Sinhala monastics are as likely to be receiving prestige, legitimating resources, and scholarly inspiration as they are to be exporting them. This is a significant and necessary corrective. And from the vantage point of someone who works on medieval Sri Lanka, I find its scope both inspiring and also slightly vertiginous. So let me now turn to several areas where the book's arguments open up terrain I hope future work, including perhaps responses from the author, will continue to explore. First is the question of the sort of variation in archives in the post-Dambadenia period in Sri Lanka. The period from roughly 1235 to 1400 is, from the perspective of indigenous textual and epigraphic production on the island, relatively thin. The Sinhala Vamsa tradition falls somewhat silent after the Chula Vamsa's account of Parakrama Baha II, and the inscriptional record becomes much more scattered. Anne navigates this challenge with kind of resourcefulness, reading across inscriptions, texts produced in South India and mainland Southeast Asia, for looking for sort of sources that have bearing on our understanding of Sri Lanka, often formulated in sort of idealized or formulaic registers. So I'm curious how she reflects in retrospect on the methodological choices involved in weighing these varied and uneven archives. When a Mon or Lanna text celebrates the Sinhala ordination lineage as authoritative, are we learning about Sri Lanka? Are we learning something about Sri Lanka, or about what certain mainland elites needed Sri Lanka to be? This is less a criticism than a genuine methodological puzzle that the book surfaces productively, and one I'd love to hear her reflect on further. The second is a series of remarks and questions on the concept of inflection itself. I find the term to be one of the book's most generative contributions, a welcome alternative to older vocabularies of Buddhist kingship that often implied a rigid ideological template. The concept captures something true and important, that Buddhist ideas and practices bent or shaped political authority without fully determining it. I wonder, though, whether Anne might say more about the range of inflection across her case studies. When a Dambadeniya king commissions a textual portrayal of himself and his court as congruent with the aesthetic and ritual expectations of kingship, such as the case in the Convent Buddha Sirita she discusses in the second chapter, and when a Lanna king endows a monastery with relics obtained through diplomatic correspondence with Lanka, are these the same kind of inflection? I ask not to challenge the concept, but because I think an explicit reflection on degrees and modes of inflection might further sharpen an already powerful analytical tool. Third, and finally, a thought about actors below or adjacent to the royal level. The book is attentive to monastics as political actors with real agency beyond serving a legitimating function, which is exactly right, I think, and long overdue. And as I was reading, I found myself wanting to follow this argument even further outward and down sort of social and political hierarchies to the merchants, port intermediaries, scribes, and manuscript carriers who made the physical circulation of texts and persons possible. The Indian Ocean turn in historiography has encouraged us to explore infrastructural underpinnings of connectivity, asking questions such as who carried the manuscripts, who funded the monks' passages, how did the rhythms of trade and the interests of merchant communities shape which connections flourished and which atrophied? I raise this not as so much a gap in the book, so much as an invitation. The Arena framework seems well positioned to absorb this dimension, and I wonder whether Anne has thoughts on how it might do that. Lastly, this question is sort of driven in part by curiosity about the products of encounter between the political actors who populate Anne's book, and one of the key conduits of connectivity in the broader world of sort of Indian Ocean historiography, and that is the Muslim merchant. We get glimpses of the convergence of these worlds at moments in the book, such as in the discussion of Sri Pada, but by and large, articulations of political authority made with reference to the Buddhasasana extend mainly to non-human powers inhering in the landscape, deities associated with several theistic traditions, and ritual techniques drawn from Sanskritic technical sciences. Less explicit are convergences with Islamic political lingua franca that also dominated the Indian Ocean world. And sort of to wrap up, I did want to ask, I mean, if Anne thinks that's sort of a fair assessment of the source materials, and if so, what are we to make of those apparent silences? So with that, I will turn it back over to MK, but also just want to say thank you again for the chance to engage with what is just like a really incredible book that I'm so happy to see in the world.
All right, thank you so much. So Anne, if you'd like to respond, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Azfar Moin and Dr. Friedrich for giving me so much food for thought. I'm appreciative. I think that one thing I'll go in order since Azfar spoke first. I'll start with those questions and then come to Phil's. Really appreciate both of you bringing.
Professor Blackburn, just a quick announcement that if any of the attendees have questions, could you please leave them in the chat? Questions for Professor Blackburn or our two respondents. And then we'll post them to each of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So one question raised by Professor Moin has to do with the sort of arc of doctrinal Buddhism, or whether there is we can identify some kind of growing commitment to Buddhism, or Buddhisasana, as I tend to call it, maybe in the course of the historical trajectories discussed in the book. And there I would say no. At least in terms of this study, I am presuming, and I continue to presume outside the study, I am presuming like strongly multi-religious environment, or sorry, let me put that differently. I'm presuming environments of multiple liberatory devotion, protective, devotional, liturgical practices in Lanka and in the mainland Southeast Asian or mainland Southern Asian environments that I'm looking at. And as far as I can see, that's the case throughout the period I'm studying, and it remains the case today. And so I'm not telling a story of folks becoming more Buddhist, or kings becoming more committed to some kind of ideal type of being Buddhist. And I'm also, I don't understand the record as demonstrating, a kind of tuning up of the Buddhistness of these persons whom I engage as focal points for the case study. But rather, in looking at I really appreciated Azfar the remarks you made drawing on the specific inscriptional materials in relation to this question, and also some of the literary materials from Lanka. When I'm in the book, when I'm treating particular discursive moments in textual treatises, in kind of chronicle narrative, in inscriptional textuality, I'm simply interested to see what aspects out of a larger Pali textual Buddhisasana related repertoire of thought are being drawn into these moments of utterance, I suppose we could say. And I'm sort of, interested to see if we can identify any patterns across space and across time. But the pattern that I'm looking for especially is not, do people become more Buddhist or more assertively affirming of certain kinds of Buddhist ideals in their rule or sovereign claims or warranting of power, but rather when persons are authorizing power for themselves or for others, what elements of Pali textual discourse related to Buddhisasana are drawn on. Okay, so and I'm really interested in the ideational world and the kind of intertextual world of articulating authority. And when I'm looking at the expansion of Pali textuality in this Pali arena, that expansion, the way I'm thinking about it, is that more and more varied instances of Pali textuality are present in this arena. And as that plurality increases, the possibilities for sovereign discourse change. And I'm presuming that am I presuming? No, I'm inclined to think on the basis of the evidence that I have been working with that there can be a tremendous amount of maybe variability, or if we want to say, we could say agility in the ways that articulations of sovereignty emerge even in the same place and the same moment, historical period. Um, uh, so and maybe so then this will actually connect us back to this idea of Buddhist-inflected sovereignty, which Azfar, you asked about very helpfully, and is a little bit of the answer to Phil as well, but we'll come back to that more specifically in a moment. As far as I can see, vis-a-vis this world of multiple liturgical orientations, protective practices, soteriological avenues, it's always Buddhist-inflected sovereignty. It's not ever Buddhist exclusivist sovereignty. And kind of keeping that hyphen, defiantly in the title against the will of probably multiple editorial agendas, was a reminder that as I see these domains, it's not a Buddhism only game or discursive environment, not at the beginning of the story, not at the end of the story. And this is perhaps important, for historical specificity and movements against anachronism. And as far as smiling, I think maybe because I have correctly followed an avenue that was possible from the question, but also, for reasons of the kind of modern hyphen contemporary implications of these histories, it's important to my mind to underscore that this is not a Buddhist exclusive environment in the period that I'm speaking about. I could say more about those contemporary implications if needed, but for now, I'll just leave it at that. So when we think about, I'm still with Asfar's questions here, when we think about sovereigns, and other would-be, powerful people making use of elements from Buddhist-sasana and argumentative materials from the world of Pali textuality. Part of the richness of your questions, Asfar, was to help us think about why and when will this happen? And in the book, one of the themes that I explore, especially in cases from the time on Khmer, Burmese locations, is to what extent does the evidence support the idea that some arguments for sovereignty or arguments for power, they invoked Buddhist elements or elements from Buddhist-sasana? Is there some kind of a pattern in which we can see those elements are being invoked as some kind of a pivot or a counterweight to something else? And so that is to say, if there's a repertoire of kind of Buddhist-sasana or Buddhism-related stuff there in the intellectual world, one of my hypotheses is that it becomes more relevant and attractive at certain moments in time as an alternative avenue. And I think the richest case to elucidate that from the book is the case of Sukhothai, where it seems possible to me that one of the reasons why Pali textual materials related to Buddhist-sasana became increasingly present in the inscriptional oeuvre is not that the kings were getting better at being Buddhist kings, but that they had more access to an intellectual cultural space that was marked by Pali Buddhist textuality, and they got interested in using it. And perhaps, and they, it's possible. It's a hypothesis in the book that part of that interest in engaging with the Pali textuality related to Buddha-sasana, and also this idea of the island of Lanka, to which Phil referred, and we can get back to that in a moment. It may have been in part a pivot away from a prior Khmer kind of cultural space of cultural authority, which had its own, devotional logics, if you will, and its own ways of warranting sovereign power in relation to potency and ideas of liberation. That might be one way of kind of thinking about one of your other questions, Azfar. The question about astrology and cosmology and Buddhist articulations getting subtracted or not, super very stimulating question and much appreciated. And the Pali textual cultural space that I'm dealing with to whatever extent in the book, I would say let's remember that it doesn't include only quote unquote scriptural texts and their commentaries. As far as I understand this space of Pali textuality, it includes Dhamma, teachings of Buddha, and all kinds of exegetical articulations of them, stuff that we might want to stick in the soteriology basket. But this Pali textual, textual culture includes so many other things as well: grammatical treatises, astrological treatises, views on cosmology, and so on. So basically, for my sort of sense of the argument, this the Pali textual materials available for Buddhist-inflected sovereignty include things that might be considered in tension with each other, according to your own sort of argumentative frame, Azfar. That is to say, soteriological progress on a certain dharmic path versus astrological protection and the ability to be the sovereign of the right moment. I actually don't see those things as being in tension. I see them as being part of an available repertoire of ways of thinking about power and protection. And in the materials that I can see, sovereigns and would-be sovereigns are regularly doing it all at once. And I'll come back to the Bodhisattva example in a moment, but it seems to me, from the evidence I see, it's like not surprising at all that, a ruler or a would-be ruler will be, at once celebrated for astrological and astronomical prowess and compared to a Buddha to be from a previous lifetime in a Jataka tale, and celebrated according to some kind of, other local lineages of prowess that may not relate to Buddhism at all. And all of that can happen, even in one inscription, or certainly in one the discursive works of one reign. And so when we go back to one last comment, I think here, and then go over to Phil's comments as questions as well. But then when we think about the really fruitful example that you raised, Azfar, about the stuff I was talking about from Dambadenia in Sri Lanka, or what's now Sri Lanka, where there's a sort of an argument going on, staged argument in a particular text, right? About, is the king going to be a good enough king by really committing to the Buddhist path as a bodhisattva? I would, I tried to argue that, we should see that text in part as, an indication of the multiple pathways for thinking about Buddha-sasana or Buddhism in relation to authority that are present at a certain point in time. And we're seeing some push-pull negotiation struggle or something like that, in an elite intellectual environment over these topics. That kind of struggle, I think, is ongoing because, when we look at any setting where we have kind of multiple there are many pathways for argumentation about what makes a Buddhist sovereign a good Buddhist sovereign. And so you never get to the, it's not that one is aiming to get to the end point of one story of what it is to be a good Buddhist sovereign, but rather that there are multiple accounts of what it is to be a Buddhist sovereign that are available. as implicit arguments and explicit arguments, and they're invoked in various ways through these textual and also sometimes material forms. I'm not sure if I've done justice to your questions, Azfar, but that's an initial attempt to kind of think in conversation with you, and I have so much valued our benefiting from your work in earlier years as well. When I decided I had to write about sovereignty, I was excited. Oh, good! Then I could try to write myself into the Mughal world and also the world of the Tamil South that has been so richly studied by my colleague Whitney Cox, Professor Whitney Cox. Phil, thank you very much for engaging so richly. As someone who does work, in both with materials from Lanka and from the, Indian Peninsula, I really appreciate the richness of that vision, and that you would take the time to think through what the book may, how the book may figure in a larger set of studies about the history of Lanka and so on. I really appreciate that. Because it's so hard for us who work on Sri Lanka now, what we now know as Sri Lanka, what I tend to call Lanka in pre-modern times. It is so difficult for us who work on Lanka to bring that island into any kind of a comparative transregional conversation. So you're taking the time to lay some of this out here today, Phil, helps with that process, and I'm really grateful. And you open up some really rich ways of thinking about how the book may figure and what we may be able to do going forward as colleagues. Yeah, this archive. So you've put your finger on a number of really salient matters, right? This archive from the early 13th century forward is tough to work with, and because you've done exemplary work with it yourself. In a slightly later period to what I focus on in the book. And the fact that we don't have substantial imperial records. We have scattered inscriptions. We often cannot piece together all of the people in a like very, very coherent narrative. We're not always sure if the person named in the text is really or the inscription is really this guy or that guy. So the references are often quite ambiguous. This is a very difficult period to work on, but this is very exciting. I love working on frontiers, and I'm using the term frontier advisedly in relation to your own excellent work on frontiers. Where we don't have much material is actually very exciting because we have to be, really stretch our own scholarly imagination. And this, I think, leads to the the multimedia approach that you signaled in some of your comments, Phil, because I think we have to read across languages, as you have done in your own work, with, for instance, Tamil as well as Sinhala, and Sinhala as well as Pali, but also, that was part of my impulse to work with material culture as well, to whatever limited extent I could, because sometimes I could have a better analysis made possible, perhaps by tying an inscription to a place and a place to a moment of struggle in some way. This problem with archives, of course, is the case also for those materials I was looking at from the time on Burmese Khmer arenas. Textual records are fairly late, and in many cases, and manuscripts are late, and so on, so on. Like, this is a period that's challenging to work with. We would give a lot for like a really solid, imperial bureaucracy archive, which we do not have. You asked a great question about inflection, range of inflection, Buddhist ideas, bent. So I think, here you're, was not being as thoughtful as you on the matter of inflection, Phil. I'm not sure about range of inflection. And maybe I hesitate also a little bit on range of inflection, because maybe that would also get us back into the, how Buddhist is really Buddhist kind of a discussion, which we were also discussing a moment ago in relation to Professor Moin's lines of question. And maybe I'm thinking about it also in a sense through a notion of, inflection as also accent and emphasis or something like that. So ways of, so to what degree are, is Buddhist stuff shaping the outcome of the utterance, but not fully determining it, or something like that. Okay, I'm not quite certain what words I would want to use because I haven't thought about it carefully, but that that comes to my mind in relation to your really interesting question. Can't say more about it now. I think I would have to think about it further. Your question and comment about whether the methodology that I've tried to use in the book could be used beyond the royal space, and can it be followed down hierarchies in looking at actors below or adjacent to royal courts, or kind of strong men courts. Yes, in principle. And then the question might be again an archival one, right? In terms of to what degree do we have the materials that allow us to kind of see the argumentative moves in textual expression and or material cultural expression that are moves that are being made by these, if you will, kind of sub-royal or royal adjacent actors. And your own work, right, has shown beautifully that in certain cases that is absolutely possible, and that one can think of a smaller scale royal actor, the rulers of smaller scale polities, merchants, operating in sovereign ways. This is your work I'm referring to, right? And in those kinds of cases, as you've shown in your own work, where we can trace, and we can often work with the inscriptional materials, as you have shown enough, that we could, I think we could, start we could work out some of these arguments. And you have done it already for the materials that you study in your own work. As I understand it, these like making claims in the name of Buddhist-asana, it can be done if we can if we have enough evidence to analyze it, it can be done all the way up and down the scale, right? And I think I understand best by thinking about those Dambadeniya materials and that fascinating character of Devapati Raja, sort of a strong man from the southwest who's in interlocution with monks and kings in this Dambadeniya period. And as far as I'm concerned, I was basically analyzing him as a mini king. And of course, and this is a line of analysis that I know has its own, cousin analyses for studies of peninsular India in earlier periods. If we could assemble enough, evidence to actually begin to assess, Devapati Raja's arguments, I would be delighted to apply the same kind of analytical approach. And I think we can begin to do it. We sort of see his arguments, perhaps, through a glass darkly, and some of the other textual materials that I mentioned in the book. So I think that the question is what kind of evidence do we have to work with, textual and otherwise. I've spoken a lot, and I know, good heavens, more than I realized even. Forgive me. Just say one more thing about silences in my own argument with respect to overlaps between these sort of this story related to Buddhism or Buddhist-asana that I'm telling, and for instance, persons associated with the tradition of Islam. Here, I think this is so your question, and now my, in the preliminary answer to it is an invitation or a plea for people to do more work, people who have Tamil materials and Persian materials, to do more work in collaboration with those of us who are working with Pali, Sinhala, et cetera, Sanskrit, Taimon, Burmese. Is there a way in which we can actually, begin to recapture more fully the world, for instance, the trans-regional space of Tamil Islam, and Tamil using and Persian using persons moving around this large Indian Ocean space, right? An Indian Ocean space that does not stop at Lanka by any means, or does not stop at Western Indian coastline. I've been curious about this for a long time, and I think maybe you and I have spoken about it intermittently, Phil, and the work of Professor Alex McKinley is relevant here as well. I've often speculated that a lot of the mobility related to this this expanding Pali Arena was mobility that was part of a larger oceanic project in which people with various roles, navigational, seafaring, mercantile, elite intellectual, cultural roles, were moving around this space. But I think we would need more of a collaborative project to begin to really bring this into sharper relief. This is one of the areas where partly the tendency towards looking at singular religious traditions as a focus impedes the scholarship, but also the linguistic boundaries impede the scholarship. So it has often seemed to me possible that some of the vectors of mobility feeding this expanding Pali Arena were mobilities in part related to Islam. I don't have the skills to study that, but in a collaborative conversation, some of that may be possible. So anyway, I'm going to reiterate my plea for more work on trans-regional Tamil.
Thank you, Anne. We do have one question in the chat in the last couple of minutes. The question is from Adam Clark, who thanks you for your research and asks if you have any brief comments as to possibly detecting varying levels and breadth of linguistic expertise in and access to Pali in the regions and over the centuries in question.
Hi, yeah, that's a huge question, Adam, and I think that's the kind of thing we have to really look at, on a kind of more specific case by case basis, not something to respond to quickly here in a webinar. You, as well as are well aware, I think, of many important textual studies, philological explorations, and so on that would begin to give us some pathways to answering that question. But that would need to be taken up in a more granular manner. But thank you for the rich question.
Faiza, how are we on time? Or do we have a 1:30 stop, or is it?
We do have actually we've lost, we had 29 attendees and we've lost a bunch of them. Yeah, I think, MK, if you have any questions, you could pose them and we could conclude.
Well, the one question I had in mind is one that Anne has asked me several times in my own career, which is just about that you've often found it generative to ask yourself what bugs you. So are there things about the project that continue to bug you that you still are sort of mulling or thinking of expanding on in some form?
Yeah, thank you, MK. Oh, it's the project is, of course, quite incomplete, and my colleagues here today have helped to show also further avenues for reflection. There are certain small projects I'm working on that we might think of as postscripts to it, or kind of extending the argument in certain directions. But really, just put the book forward as an invitation to conversation. And if the idea of, Pali Arena and Buddhist-Inflected Sovereignties, has any legs, then I'm delighted. But yeah. So I guess I would say, if the project opens conversations, then I'll be grateful to be a part of any of them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time and the time of our two fantastic discussants. I'm so grateful to everyone for joining us today. And again, thanks to Faiza, Alicia, and all of the various supporters here at Dartmouth for making today's webinar possible. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Nice to meet you, MK Long.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Thank you so much, MK, Azfar, Phil. Azfar, I hope I managed to answer your questions. It was very fruitful to come into a